History 101, How Black History is Being Taught in the Classroom.
By Ryan Shepard and Danielle Germain.
So before we get into our topic, we're going to talk a little bit about how we're going to approach our presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about scholarly discourse, which is the conversation between scholars and academics and professors. Then popular discourse, which is discussion in the media. And then our discourse, our personal experiences. So before we get into the actual presentation, we want to talk a little bit about why we decided to choose this topic and why this topic was of interest to us. For me, it was really, really personal. Like as a kid, I would go through dictionaries, encyclopedias, put together PowerPoints, and about topics that I really wanted to learn more about, but wasn't really learning that much about. And one of those topics was African American history, because I didn't feel like I got taught a lot about that in the classroom as an elementary school student, a middle school student, and when I went to boarding school for high school. I just didn't feel like I got a full, well-rounded education about those certain topics. And I wanted to learn more about why it was or why I had a different experience.
For me, growing up in a predominantly white area, as a kid, I wasn't really exposed to all the things that I was exposed to when I got to college. So a lot of the time I'd be learning about, things that happened in history that weren't related to people that looked like me. So I was really interested in this topic because I wanted to know why I wasn't shown more about my history in the classroom.
Our first section is called Scholarly Discourse, which is the conversation being had between academics, professors, and people of the like. We looked at 3 specific people in this section. The first was LeGarrette King of the University of Missouri, where he's a professor of social studies and education. And he did a study where he surveyed students and teachers between the kindergarten and 12th grade. And he wrote that key findings indicate that teachers considered Black history as influential in understanding the complexity of U.S. history. He also found that the most often taught topics relating to Black history are forced African migration, slavery, Brown v. Board of Education, the impact of the Civil Rights Act, and the Obama election. The second person that we looked at was Jamila Pitts, who was an English teacher at the International Schools of the Dominican Republic. And she wrote that for many students, their exposure to Black history is all too brief. She also found that this teaching between certain months promotes a system of otherness, where we only talk about Black history in certain spaces, months, and lessons, instead of throughout the year, which causes a negative impact on how students approach Black history. The last person that we looked at was Carter G. Woodson, who you pointed us to. In his piece, The Miseducation of the Negro, he wrote that how we have arrived at the present state of affairs can be understood only by studying the forces affected in the development of Negro education, since it was systematically undertaken immediately after emancipation, which basically says what we've learned in the first 2 parts, in Pitt's work and King's work, that the reason why we're there, we have to understand where we've been, and the forces that took place immediately. The next section that we're going to talk about is popular discourse, which is how this subject is being talked about in the media. And we looked at 3 specific articles. The first being an article written by Keisha L. Bentley Edwards in Time magazine. In this article, she talks about how, as a kid, she thought that depictions of African slavery were not necessarily realistic, and they were often too short. She also writes that incessantly reciting lists of Black inventions and firsts without discussing the context of accomplishments provided only a shell of what Carter G. Woodson wanted. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with Woodson. To understand where we are, we have to understand where we've been. And where we are right now is just reciting lists. And in this subject, we talked about Donald Earl Collins' article, where he cites a lot of great studies, and one being the National System of Educational Progress, finding that only 18 to 27% of 8th graders tested proficient in American history. He also found that only 8% of high school seniors identified slavery as the cause of the Civil War. This is deeply troubling and problematic, but it limits Black history to only being the struggle that we talk about: slavery, the Civil War, other traumatic incidents. And the last person we looked at was John William Templeton, who tried to provide a solution where we would talk about Black history as meticulously talk about mathematics and physics.
Okay, so between now and our final project, there are a few things that we want to improve. One thing we're thinking about doing is interviewing students on their K-12 experience, whether in person or through a Google form. We're also thinking about speaking with professors or local teachers on how they're running lessons in their classrooms. We're also thinking about providing more information on scholarly discourse and popular discourse through more articles and maybe expanding to movies and videos. And we're also thinking about turning the presentation into a website or doing a video like we're the ones teaching a lesson.